So hello and welcome. Happy Friday. Today is Friday, March the 19th, and this is episode number 102 of Backyard Beekeeping Questions and Answers. The questions that we're discussing today were submitted during the past week. You can submit your own by writing them down in the comment section below or following the link down in the video description to my webpage, thewaytobee.org. And you can fill out a form right there and submit your own question, even if you're not a member of Facebook or YouTube or any of that. So this is also a podcast, of course. If you're listening and not seeing, then welcome to the podcast, which is on Podbean, which is also The Way to Bee. So there's that, and there's also a link to the Way to Bee Fellowship on Facebook, where you can talk about bees, share pictures, show videos, learn, get your questions answered day or night, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. There's always something going on there. It's great. There's more than 1,100 members now, so thank you to those who've joined that and are happily sharing information back and forth and showing situations you're dealing with and getting feedback from your peers. Always great. And as you saw in the opening sequences, super cold still. Even though it's really sunny right now, it's deceptive. You look outside, you think it's fantastic. You're going to zip out there and see some bees flying. Well, not where I live, here in the northeastern United States, the state of Pennsylvania. The bees are not flying today. It's just too cold. Crocus have bloomed, things like that. The pussy willows are not yet providing any pollen, so they're not in bloom. I have all those plants, samples of a lot of different plants right on my property, just so I can look at them and see what the pollen sources are. So if you looked earlier this week and saw my post about the honeybees feeding on the dry pollen sub, that's what they're taking right now, and it's Ultra Bee. And I put it out there in an egg carton because I found out that the bees can hang on to the egg carton better and they waste less time and energy trying to get away from the pollen feeder. So it's a win-win, and this is the way to be. So again, I'm glad you're here. If you're new, welcome. If you're a repeat viewer, thank you for coming back. And don't forget to click the like button down there so you know that you've watched this episode, because there's going to be a lot more in the future. So that's it. But the good news is the weekend's coming. It's going to be super warm. And the bees are going to fly again. We're going to make sure to beef them up. We'll talk a little bit more about beefing up your colonies later today. So the very first question we're going to talk about is by Chad Sutton. Hey Fred, if a hive dies over the winter and it had varroa, do all the varroa die as well? And I can't remember from your past videos, but can I do an oxalic acid treatment in the spring? FYI, I live in Illinois. By the way, I used to live in Illinois. My stepfather and my mom taught at the University of Illinois. Interesting. So anyway, can you do oxalic acid treatment? But the other thing is the varroa question. First of all, what are varroa? Varroa destructor mites are the number one enemy of the honeybee that's being managed by people here in the United States. Number one, carrier of pathogens. It does incredible damage, reduces their longevity. So we have the foragers much less time available than they otherwise would be, and also it affects reproduction, and they reproduce in the pupae of the bee. So we hate them, and we want to get rid of these varroa mites. So the question is, when a colony dies, so we're digging into our winter colonies now, and hopefully you didn't lose all your bees this winter. Those reports are coming in fast and furious, and it's really sad. So if your bees die, we need to take a look at them, see what's going on. And what you often find when you're looking at your dead bees will be the body of those tiny little varroa mites. They're kind of a burgundy color, little jerks on your bee bodies. So the thing is, they're parasitic. What do they feed on? They feed on the fluids that they extract from your honeybees. So in the absence of a honeybee, they've lost their host, therefore they've lost their life force. Their resources. It's gone, so they die too. It's really weird because Randy Oliver at Scientific Beekeeping did some tests on the varroa mites, and it was astonishing to read about the treatments that he did. And he did a bunch of evaluations of different release chemicals for the varroas when you're doing your varroa counts. So some people use the alcohol wash, which kills all the nurse bees that you're testing. Some people use a sugar shake, like me. And then you count your mites there. And there are other things that you can do. And that was because I guess there was a shortage of isopropanol. So then he tested some other things. One of the things was like Dawn dishwashing detergent. So Dawn Free, I believe it's called. It was really interesting that the bees died quickly, but that the mites often were alive even after being in suspension, much longer than the honeybees themselves. So varroa destructor mites are super rugged, resistant, strong, capable. One thing they cannot do is live without the host. So back to the original question, when your bees die, the mites die also. So that's the good news. So when they die out, there's no such thing as like a mite bomb from a dead colony coming out in spring. So for example, there are still pathogens in there. There's still the potential for disease to be in that colony. So if you've got bees that zip in there and start robbing out the resources once they don't have the defense of the resident bees anymore, then the potential to get bacteria, pathogens, and other associated diseases can still be passed on to your bees, but the mites themselves are dead, so they can't jump on your bees and take a free ride back to an otherwise healthy colony. So I hope that's helpful. The next part of this question was, can I do oxalic treatment in the spring? And living in Illinois, for example. Well, it really doesn't matter where you live, but when your bees start flying, when are the varroa numbers generally the highest? They're the highest going into fall when your bees have their greatest population as they're condensing more mites per bees. Because the number of bees that are available for the mites to clamber onto and feed from gets reduced going into fall because the foragers are dying off and they're not being replenished because your queen is not laying as many eggs as she would be, say, going into spring. So the mites that are left, they're referred to as phoretic mites when they're clambering all over the bodies of the bees. So in the absence of brood. So here in Pennsylvania, when your bees get to the lowest brood period, so it's a cessation of egg laying. And they do that most frequently here, and these are general statistical information, statistics that come in about who's got the largest brood pattern at what times of the year. So the end of November, beginning of December, right in there, that's a sweet spot, lowest amount of brood. Therefore, the brood that you do have is going to have mites dogpiling all over each other to get in there. So they're all exposed. That's the best time to treat with oxalic acid vaporization. Or dribble if that's what you're doing, but the dribble, you have concerns over the temperature. So you have to be very careful about that, while the oxalic acid vaporization can be done at all those temperatures, in the cold, in the warm, everything like that. So you can, but I would like you to do a mite check first, because when you are doing, here's the setup. What should you have with you when you do a spring hive inspection? And you're looking to see if you have a viable queen, if she's laying, if you've got open larvae, and what the pupa looks like, what the brood looks like. So the pupa, you don't get to see them because they're capped, but how much capped brood do you have? What's the pattern look like? If everything starts to look healthy, then you'll go to those brood frames where you see people poke their finger, you got the comb up there and here's all the capped brood, and they poke their finger and push the bees around and everything, and those bees are so passive they move right out of the way. Those are the nurse bees. They're the nicest, friendliest, most easygoing bees in the hive. So you can push them around, blow on them a little bit, get them out of the way so you can see what's going on there. But those are also the bees that you want to collect to do your mite counts on. So if you don't want to kill them, you can use the sugar shake method, and you have to do it right. It takes a lot more time. Will take fewer mites, so if you get a very low sugar shake count, you might have to follow up with your alcohol wash if you want to be absolutely sure. But even the state inspector came and he did a sugar shake on my hives, and he went hive by hive, and he said after the 6th or 7th colony he inspected, he said he was wasting his time looking for mites because they were clean. He found one mite. But that's the sugar shake method. So here we are with beekeepers having a difference of opinion and approach. See, my thinking is, my most valuable bees are my nurse bees. So if I'm going to kill 300 of them, yikes, why not just do the sugar shake method? Because here's the thing. Would I have to treat if I did the sugar shake? And out of 300 bees collected, let's say I had 10 mites in there. Would I treat those, or would I go on and do a alcohol wash to validate that I had a high mite count? Well, the alcohol wash in general will yield more dead mites. So I already know that's a treatment level. So I would treat. Now if I had 1 or 2 with the sugar shake, 1 or 2 mites in there, am I going to treat? Not me. I'm going to get those mites. I'm going to look at them under the microscope and see the condition. Look at their feet, see if they're chewed, and see if they're damaged and injured. And if they are, I've got really good grooming bees that are taking them off, and not only that, chewing their feet on the way out. So unless you can validate that you need to treat based on mite count, see, some people just want to treat because it seems okay to do. But I want to know what the mite loads are because I want to know which colonies are doing the best, and we're going to discuss that a little more today too. I am breaking apart my bee yard, and I'll explain why, and there's a lot to it. But you can treat in spring, yes. Oxalic acid, if the numbers justify it. Let me add some notes down here. That's about it. So that's the end of the first question. Let's get right into the next question. This is from... Oh my gosh, I don't know. Oh, Pete from the UK, England. So the question is, apart from when the honey super is on, can I keep the hive as a single brood box colony? By removing and replacing frames to give them the new building areas, is there any chance you could retouch on a single brood box information on your YouTube program? I've been watching since episode 70. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all of you who come back and watch time after time. I really appreciate it. So the single brood box method, there are some people that keep their bees in single brood boxes. If you're following Dr. Tom Seeley, I know some people get very annoyed by Dr. Seeley's natural approach to beekeeping. But he does have a formula where he recommends a single deep, and this doesn't matter if you're using an 8-frame or 10-frame box. In my experience here, 14 years of beekeeping in cold climates, they do equally well in the 8 or 10-frame box. So we can put that out of the way. It's really a matter of how much you want to lift when it comes to the physical weight of them, because I have bees that go through in a single box, and I'll talk about why. But I don't practice single box beekeeping. But Dr. Seeley says 1 deep box and 1 medium super, and then that should be your whole colony. Now that requires some very careful management. Because what does that facilitate? What's going to happen here in the spring? If we go with that single deep and a medium super, which should be their honey stores, which are going to get them through winter. And as I've said before, I leave everything to the bees. Those first 2 bottom boxes, whether it's 2 deeps or a deep and a medium, all of that is left to the bees. So I let them build up those resources, their pollen, their brood pattern gets established, and then that medium box is full of honey. Before we go on with anything else, it's going to result in us harvesting that honey. So anything beyond the second box becomes ours later. And if we take that off and then we hit a dearth period, they still have resources down below. The whole point is to avoid supplemental intervention, which is what a lot of us are having to do right now because we've lost a lot of colonies of bees. And those that we do have, we want to boost them. We want to build their numbers up. But what is going to happen if you have a single brood box and that's the way you want to manage your bees? This is what I would equate to my observation hive, because my observation hive is only 8 deep frames. So it's the equivalent of a single deep brood box with nothing else. So what do? That's my swarm machine. That colony builds up, their numbers get big, their stores get built up, and pretty soon they're out of space. Their numbers exceed the space they're occupying, and what are they going to do? They're going to swarm. So now you have to be prepared to divide it, to split it, to collect a swarm. So you can split it ahead of time, divide the numbers, and keep the resources available to them, including space for expansion. Physical bodies need to be accommodated inside that hive. So if you're not going to expand the hive, there's going to be swarming, or you're going to have to split it where I live. Now maybe you live in an area where the resources are so spartan that the bees will never really accumulate big enough numbers. So that might not even be an issue at all. So for me, during the year, I put supers on like the Flow Supers. Flow Hive Supers, that's my third or fourth box up. It is never the second box, which is actually the original design of the company that designed the Flow Hive. So I have the deep with the brood, the resources, early spring, nectar, pollen, everything else all in that box. And then as that fills up, 8 or 9 frames get full of the 10, or 6 or 7 frames of the 8. That's when I add the next box on, and then we let them fill that up. Once that's full, that's when I put on the supers that I'm going to take off later, which for me would be the Ross Round supers on top during the nectar flow, or the Flow Super, which is, those are the mechanized frames. That's what that looks like back here. And then I can drain off, as they cap those frames, I can drain them off and they have immediately more space. Honeybees are hoarders. They collect more nectar than they will ever use. If left to themselves, they'll fill the box and they'll depart. So a single box, that method, can I have a hive as a single box, brood box colony? Now, a single brood box, that might imply that you're going to have, an infinite number of honey supers going up as the year goes on, and then you reduce them back as the year comes to an end, and then now we're condensed back down to that single brood box, and then enough resources to get through winter. And by the way, I'd like to touch on, you could do that, just be prepared to evaluate everything as it goes, because if they exceed the space they're in, they're going to swarm. So what did I want to talk about on that? When you're condensing it down, going into winter, now here's the other thing. I've had 8 and 10 frame swarms that were captured in the late season. And by late, I'm talking mid-September, late September. A swarm just, for some reason, they decide this is the time of year that they need to find a new home, which is terrible timing for the bees. I lost one of my really iffy colonies last year, right going into fall, because they decided to swarm out of a flow hive too, by the way. They didn't realize, I guess, that the resident hive that they had was like the best thing ever. Why would they leave it? But they did. And so once they fly out, and you get a swarm in the late season, most beekeepers just won't do anything with it. Let it go. Because there's the old sayings, a swarm in June is worth a silver spoon. A swarm in May is worth a load of hay. A swarm in July, let them fly. So they're even letting them go in July. For me, I'm getting those rascals. I'm going to hive them. So anyway, I put them in a single box, which means I had a single deep box. In one case, it was only an 8 frame. In another one, it was a 10. And we're not talking last fall. We're talking the year before. And I was trying out Better Comb, the pre-drawn synthetic wax. So I put 3 or 4 frames of that in there to get them going quick. And of course, we put an inner cover on. And then we put sugar syrup on if it's still warm enough for that. And it was. As we start building those guys up, and they went right into winter. And I thought they would just be, as many of you are seeing in the spring of this year, I thought I would just find, dead outs. I had 5 of them going into winter, and 5 of them survived, all in single boxes, single deeps, with nothing else, just the emergency feed on top. So a tiny cluster of bees, their demands are lower. The resources they need to get through winter are lower. The more insulation they have on them, specifically, if you're insulating anything at all, insulate the top of your hive. 1 inch thick or better of polystyrene, for example. We're using the BMAX covers this year. Worked extremely well because guess what I noticed coming into spring this year? More honey reserves than I've ever seen on these colonies. So now they have more than they need. They're barely touching the emergency sugar, dry sugar that's on top, and it's all good news. So insulating the hive top with no upper venting was my formula going into winter last year. And that insulation at the top allowed condensation to form on the interior walls going down and so on. And the reason I bring this up is it doesn't seem logically like that would work. If you're, as a human, looking at something, you'd be freezing cold. Big deal that you have a warm overhead, but the side walls are still freezing cold, and then the cluster is generating all this warmth, and they migrate up and hover just underneath that polystyrene cover, which of course has a feeder shim surrounding it, and then there's an inner cover there, and that's where the feed is. So, but they can get through winter in a single deep box. And they come out fighting. They are the first to fly. Like the other day, the single box colonies were flying, which tells me they need resources. But then when you look inside the hive, they don't, because there's still honey in there, capped honey. Did I just ramble? Can I keep hives as a single brood box colony? Yes, you can. And this again is regional. How well they're going to do, the environment, the resources that you have, but you got to watch them because they can expand really fast. They can explode. They start in a really small box and they take off like crazy. The next question comes from Holden Glova. I hope I said that right, Glova. So I'm down in New Zealand and we are finishing up our summer. On my biggest hive, I put on a box of Ross rounds. I did a whole video about Ross rounds, by the way. You can look at that. Maybe I should link it so you can see how they work. Most of them are still uncapped, so I do not want to pull them off yet. However, I must be treating for varroa too. What can I do? Okay, so this leads us into a discussion point that is circling around everywhere right now. Can we use oxalic acid vaporization on hives with honey on that you're going to consume? The federal government has said that you can. But now we're getting down to little sticky wickets about what's on the actual label of the oxalic acid that's approved for use as a miticide in your beehives. First of all, not every state adopted the use of oxalic acid vaporization. So who are you going to go to? The EPA, your Department of Agriculture, should have those answers as to whether or not you're allowed to do that. Now down in New Zealand, I don't know what the rules are yet. But here it's been green lighted for use with your honey supers on. So, not ready to pull those off yet, but there's a mite. Now this is in New Zealand, so New Zealand must have mites. So anyway, the next part of this question is, what can I do? Formic Acid Pro? I read this is okay to treat with honey supers on, and it is. Formic Pro is approved for treatment with your honey supers on. But you need to pay attention to a lot of stuff about Formic Pro. It can be dangerous stuff. You get a whiff of that stuff. What is Formic Pro? It comes in these little strips, and you peel off that outer cover, and the inner cover, that little fabric strip on there, is a wicking material that allows it to vaporize into your colony. So obviously I have this sheet. I have boxes of Formic Pro this year. Why? Because I'm not going to use oxalic acid vaporization with the honey supers on. Not because it's not legal, but because it's less effective based on testing, based on supporting documents and research. Oxalic acid vaporization, king of the hill for me when it comes to the period that I described earlier on today, which is the end of November, the beginning of December, when the brood is low and the mites are exposed. Get them. A single treatment of oxalic acid will knock them flat. So, now we're on to something else, and Formic Pro, very, there is a lot of this. For a new beekeeper, this is an area where if you tell somebody, well, I'm going to treat with formic acid, then some people are going to, well, get ready to replace that queen because she's going to be dead, and get ready to replace a bunch of your bees because they're going to die. But I have other issues with it that I will also talk about later. But what I want to talk about right now is with the Formic Pro, it is approved. It's approved with honey supers on. It's approved not to impact the flavor of your honey and what you're going to do with that for human consumption, for the bees, for anything you want to do. It's organic. So now the other thing is a bunch of bees may die off. And the other thing is we're going back to scientific beekeeping with Randy Oliver, who did tests with Formic Pro. He did Mite Away Quick Strips, by the way, which has been replaced by Formic Pro. And the Formic Pro is a little more stable, longer shelf life. You can keep it for 2 years. So mine's good for 2022 because I may not have to use it this year. So keep it on the shelf, ready to go. So now, if you use it, you can do, there's 2 treatment choices. These strips lay right on top of the brood box, the lowest brood box. If you have 2 brood boxes, it would be on the top and the bottom one in the center. So the other thing was, these tests were done. You have an option to use 2 strips at once with a single treatment. Single treatment will be 14 days. There was another test, also done by Randy Oliver, where you follow the second method, which is to put one strip on, leave it for 10 days, remove that one, put a second strip on, leave it for the second 10 days for a total of 20 days. That had better impact on the mites, killed more of them. Then you can get rid of them. Now, I have concerns about it. We're going to talk about them later. But one of the problems with Randy Oliver's test was, and he admits it, that he went way above the recommended temperature parameters for the treatment of mites with Formic Pro. And so there was a bee die-off impact on your queen fertility and things like that. You can read it at scientificbeekeeping.com. The key here is the temperature range of that stuff, 50 to 80 degrees. It says in the instructions 50 to 85, but other research show that above 80, of course, it's more volatile because it evaporates quicker, and these gases go throughout the hive, right through the cappings of your pupa. So which is what makes it effective, but which is what also makes it potentially detrimental to your bees if the temperatures are high. Also, if it's below 50, what happens? It's not volatile enough. So there isn't enough vapor going out to be effective against the mites. So 50 is the starting point. 80 to 85 would be your upper limit cutoff, day or night. And it's the strongest the first 3 days, which is why they found that the 2 10-day treatments was a little bit better than the single double pack treatment, which went on for 14 days. So that's okay to treat. And kind of leaving you up in the air on that, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. But for right now, you need to very carefully look into oxalic acid vaporization. It will require multiple treatments. The good news is it's less invasive. You can do a vaporization right through a 1/4-inch hole through the back of your hive, but you would have to do multiple treatments and follow them up with mite counts. If you don't do that, you have no idea how effective the treatment was and if you solved the mite problem for your bees. That's why I only now, personally, will be using the oxalic acid vaporization, lowest brood period, single treatment. Next question, Emery Gurpinar, Gurpinar. Can you please explain why you decided to raise your own stock of treatment-free, varroa-resistant bees in your backyard and move the treatment-required bees to another location? Last year, you were mentioning the success with oxalic acid vaporization. I will appreciate if you can explain why you decided not to use it in your main apiary. Okay, well, like this is part of beekeeping. We learn as we go. So I just have a different approach. It's not that, because remember, I was treatment-free for over 10 years. All I did was work with survivor stock and everything else, but I'm learning as I go too. And yes, not last year, but the year before, when I started to see that I had high mite counts, I treated with oxalic acid vaporization, and the impact was immediate. And we knocked the mites right down to 1 or none in mite counts after the treatment. And that's going into winter, and then of course they go into winter healthier because they don't have the pathogens that are passed on by the mites going into winter when they're making those critical fat-bodied bees, and so on. It's just healthier. Get rid of the mites, we get rid of a huge list of potential problems. Deformed wing virus being at the top of the chart for things that damage your bees, coming vectored by the mites. So anyway, what I've been doing is thinking more about biosecurity than ever before, and I'm just learning new things. I'm paying attention to studies and what's going on. And it occurred to me, because I've said it before, if you have an apiary in your backyard, because that's my target group, most of my viewers have 20 colonies or less. Some only have 2 or 3. So you have that one colony that you do a mite count, and that colony is loaded with mites. So we're going to treat them, right? And here's where, this is why you have to continually be on the learn when it comes to beekeeping. And that's because I also have learned that when you're doing a treatment for mites, now we close it up during the treatment period. So you expose them to oxalic acid vaporization. The microdust settles all over every interior surface, including the surface of the bees. You do this in the late afternoon, early evening, so as many of the foragers as possible are in the colony. We're closing them up for 10 minutes for treatment. And the minute you open it up, they're venting everything off. And of course, this kills phoretic mites, those that are exposed. Guess what else the bees do? Now let's say right next to them I have a colony of these wonderful bee weaver bees that, yes, I'm still working with. Last year or year before, I started with some Saskatraz that I'm not going to continue to work with. Anyway, so now the ones, they start to migrate over to other colonies. Studies were done where they counted the number of bees that were non-resident bees, drift. So workers that went from one colony to another. So if we've got a colony that's loaded with mites, and they're also, see, it's not just the physical mite. Once you get rid of that, we still have diseased bees. So now they go into the other colonies. You can have as many as 30 or 40% of your workforce of any colony composed of non-resident bees. That's a shocking number. And we were having a group discussion on Zoom with Randy Oliver. And I brought it up. I thought, well, you know, if you have an apiary in your backyard and you've got, you know, most of your bees are making it, but let's say half the apiary requires treatment. Half the apiary is infected with mites. What if you went with Formic Pro? Formic Pro is a long exposure treatment compared to oxalic acid vaporization. When you put this Formic Pro in there, and everybody is telling me to use it, people that I respect, that have, you know, super smarts, not the normal backyard person like myself. But they're saying Formic Pro is what you need to use. So this is my question I asked Randy. I said, so if we treat a colony that's loaded with mites and we put this formic in here, what keeps those bees from zipping out of there because they don't like the environment and just joining forces with another colony that otherwise would not require treatment? Would you treat that colony too, just because of the potential for the spread due to the bees that are going to evacuate that formic treated colony? Because let's be honest, when they hit it with formic, bees collect all over that hive. They get out of there because they don't like it. And it kills the mites, of course, but bees don't like it either. So in my thinking, you know, we're just going to spread that through to the other colonies that are otherwise healthy. So now we're spreading mites everywhere because the mites want to get out of there too. They're going to jump right on the backs of the bees that are departing. So he said nobody's looked into that. That was the answer. So then my other question was, then does that mean you would treat colonies that otherwise wouldn't require the treatment? Because now, if we put the formic in every colony, the foragers have nowhere to go, no safe haven. And then he said they've found mite drift, not mite drift, but bee drift can go as far as 2 miles. Well, that's a great answer. So now you could have somebody who has mite bombs in their backyard apiary, and let's say they treat it with Formic Pro, and those workers zip out of there and they don't want to go home because the environment at home is a hostile environment and they just don't want to go back there. So what they do is they get their nectar and their pollen and they go land at some other colony somewhere else that's totally alien. They get invited in because they're loaded with those resources. So now what we're doing is we're spreading the disease because we're pushing them out of a diseased colony that requires treatment, and off they go into some other colony that otherwise would have been perfectly healthy. So then he said he would treat all of them then. So my goal to answer this question is to work with treatment-free bees as much as possible. Therefore, my genius brain, above average brain, is thinking, well, then if I have the high mite count bees, I got to get them out of my backyard apiary, and I only want to keep the core group of colonies, even if that means 4, 5, 6 colonies of those that are going and keeping the mites under control, treatment-free. And then those that I need to treat, I'll put them in a separate apiary. So when I get a high mite count number, I'm transporting the colony, and I'm going to set them up in another bee yard altogether, and all those bees I know will require treatment, and if I treat one, I treat them all. Now on the flip side of that, if one of those colonies starts looking really good, and they have low mite counts, let's say I caught a swarm, and I put it in my, let's call it the, let's call it the medical ward. Let's call it like a sick tank, a medicine tank, a hospital tank that you would have if you were keeping tropical fish. So you have an unknown animal in there. So these bees are in there, and we want to see what they're doing before we bring them to our prime apiary. So my backyard apiary right here on this property is going to be my prime apiary, those that don't require treatment. But now if they're in the treatment apiary and they come in consistently with low mite counts, 1 or 2 mites, I'm taking that colony, bringing it back here. Likewise, if I have a colony in my treatment-free apiary that starts to build in numbers of mites, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, anything above 2 or 3% of the bees counted has mites on them, then they will go to the treatment apiary. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm trying to do, is I'm dividing my stock. Now, if you're a purist and you're really pragmatic about it, you would probably kill the colonies, but then what if they develop or demonstrate resistance later? Because what if that mite count was high because of their proximity to another colony that was high, and it wasn't the fault of the resident colony there in that hive? So having my sick colony area, which probably nobody wants to be around, but they get treated. They don't just turn into mite bombs. I'm going to treat those. But we're doing mite counts ahead of time, treat mite counts after time, after that period, to validate whether the treatment worked or not. But those who had low mite counts are watched as favorable and potential for coming back to my treatment-free apiary. That's what I'm doing. I hope that's clear as mud right there. So if you have further questions about that, that's what I'm doing this year. Getting rid of colonies that require treatment, but I will treat them where they go, and keeping only colonies that do not require treatment right here, even if that comes down to just 1 colony of bees. All right, maybe 2. So that's what I was mentioning. Oxalic acid vaporization did work, but remember that I was working with bees that were already doing pretty well on their own, and it just tipped the scales in my favor. And that's the only year in all the years that I've been keeping bees that I got all of my colonies through winter. The only year that that's happened. Next question, suede skills. Will bees use old, last year's stored pollen? I had a hive last year that got pollen bound, and I pulled some of those frames when I got the chance in the fall. I froze and stored them, but now I'm wondering if I give these frames to a nuke, will the bees use the pollen? I also understand that bees will not move pollen around the hive like they will with nectar and honey. So I'm again left wondering, will bees use stored pollen from the previous year? I never recommend moving pollen around from one colony to the next. The other thing is, bees, when there's a nectar flow on and there's pollen available in the environment, and some plant sources are yielding pollen without yielding nectar, and the bees will still collect the pollen. So when there is new pollen available, they are going to favor the use of that pollen above and beyond any stored pollen. The other thing is, what else is stored with the pollen? And this has been tested. So different laboratories have been sent frames of pollen, and so we can identify not so much the pollen source, but its composition as far as, and this is the worst part, pesticide load. So when pesticide loads are built up in the pollen because of the plants that they came from, the bees somehow figure out that some of that pollen is not suitable to feed to the developing larvae, and the nurse bees don't consume it. So then when that's evaluated, and these studies, I don't know right off the top of my head where the study was done, but they actually would entomb or encapsulate pollen cells. So they would put a really heavy layer of sealer over the top of it. So rather than excavate the cell, clean it out, and make it ready for future use, they encapsulated it and embalmed it, whatever they did, and they left it there untouched. So what happens is you get this really old, greasy, dark-looking pollen stuck in the cells that the bees never revisit. So that even when they're doing hygiene throughout the colony and stuff like that, they're not excavating and cleaning it out. They're just leaving it sealed and working around it. The newer pollen that gets brought in gets used first. So they would have to be desperate and completely out of pollen to dig into their older pollen stores. So they do show an overwhelming preference for fresh pollen. Just, and that's better for the bees, so why wouldn't they? So your chances, so if I were pulling pollen from hives and freezing it and storing it and then trying to put it back in, I would power wash out that pollen. I would clean the frame and get it ready for the bees, and not try to carry on the old pollen for new bees, because the fresher pollen is going to be better for them anyway. So I hope that answers that question. It's very likely that the bees are going to ignore it and not use it, and then you've just put that in there. Plus, it may have concentrations of pesticides, as I mentioned before. Pollen pesticide residue studies. Google that maybe, and you'll find it. It's pretty darn interesting. Next question comes from Jorlyn Moranti from Tampa, Florida. And my name is Jorlyn. I live in Central Florida. The bees are booming here, and it's swarm season. I got a swarm from one of my hives today. This is the second swarm from the same hive. The first one was too high in a tree to safely acquire. Bummer, but safety first. But this swarm I was able to hive. My question is, what measures do you take when newly hived swarms? What do you like to personally do? I have an extra drawn comb I'm planning to put inside. What else do you recommend that I do? Okay, now, there's some key things going on here that are really important. One is there was already a swarm. That's what we would call a prime swarm, especially in spring. Prime swarms, first ones to come out, those are golden because usually they're giant. They're thousands and thousands of bees, pounds of bees. Not only that, who left with them? The best queen. She got through winter. And so they're all with her, strong queen pheromone, everything else. That's a fantastic hive to get. Unfortunately here they were high in the tree. Guess what else happened? Now we're describing an after swarm. What's really key here is, when did this after swarm happen? Because sometimes they happen in rapid succession. So the existing queen will be there, she zips out. What's about to hatch inside the hive? New queens from queen cells or supersedure cells, but usually in the spring, prime swarm goes out, after swarm goes out. That after swarm may have an unmated queen. So the after swarms are generally smaller, so what do I do with them? Well, I can't do what I would do with the prime swarm, but you want to make them comfortable, so you're going to put them in a deep box. I like to put them in straight into a deep 10 frame or 8 frame box. I don't do anything else, but I try to make sure that there's as much drawn comb in there as possible. You're a new beekeeper. Maybe you don't have a bunch of drawn comb ready to go. What could you do? You could use better comb, which is also known as hexacell. It comes from Hungary. It's sold by Better Bee. And you can put 3 or 4 frames, deep frames of better comb in there to give them a place to immediately set up residence and start that queen laying. The problem is, if she's a virgin queen, she has not matured, has not done her mating flights and everything else, so you're in jeopardy there. You could lose everything. They could just leave. That's why after swarms are so tricky. So we have to make it as inviting as possible to get them to stay there. So the way you can do that, pre-drawn cells right in the center, help them build their brood area. You want to put feed on. What kind of feed are you going to put on? Sugar syrup. So in the spring, 1-to-1 sugar syrup, and we want that because that's what they're going to use to build infrastructure, and they're going to consume it readily to serve as a carbohydrate so they can stay warm and everything. And hopefully within the next 9 days, that queen shows up mated and you can check in on them. Don't open the hive for 2 weeks. As long as they're coming and going, what are the telltale signs that the queen starts laying without opening the hive? How do you know that it's working? Guards at the gate, for one. Number 2, pollen coming in. Pollen coming in rapid succession. So once she starts to lay eggs, 3 days after an egg is laid, it's going to hatch out. It's going to release a pheromone that stimulates those nurse bees to start feeding them. So that's when you're going to start to see a lot of pollen production. So the bees should be bringing in pollen, more than 10 per minute. Standard rule of thumb there. And then you'll know they're set and you've got her, because those are the anchors. That's what's going to keep them there and keep that sugar syrup going on there. I know this is contrary to what a lot of natural beekeepers want to do. They just want to let them make it or not. I like to entice them to stay with me. So, small box, just a single. Don't put them in a bunch of boxes together. Some people, brand new beekeepers especially, get a kit from Better Bee or Dedant or Man Lake or wherever they get it. They put the bottom board in, they put their slatted rack in, They put their deep box on, they put 2 medium supers on, they put the inner cover on, they put the outer cover on, and they put their swarm in there. That is too much space. They're insecure in that space. They might abandon it. The other problem is they'll rise to the very top box, which is later going to be your honey super. That's what it's supposed to be for. But if you put a swarm in there, they're going to go right to the top, and they're going to start building their infrastructure up there. Because in the spring, that's going to be the warmest part of that hive. Then later they'll migrate down. But if we start with just a single box, put your swarm in there, then an inner cover with a wraparound feeder on top of that. This is what a wraparound feeder looks like. It sits right on the inner cover. Sugar syrup out the wazoo in here. And then you can look in on them and look through this clear plastic piece and see if they're up there drinking the syrup. That's another sign that they're sticking around. But the after swarms, those are risky, because that queen can still fly and she may not have been mated and so on. But once she starts laying eggs, you're in business. So that's what I would do. Now for the prime swarm, I do one thing different to keep them from taking off again, because they're huge, they're strong. Once you know for sure that you've got the queen, I would, on the bottom board, I would put, this is undersized, but this is a queen excluder. If you're going to collect a prime swarm and the queen is in there and you know she's mated because it's the first one, plus it's a huge swarm. After swarms, non-mated queens tend to be smaller. So you put this on top of your bottom board, you dump all your bees in there with the queen, close it up, single board, same configuration as before. But now the only ones that can get out and go foraging and come and go and leave that colony will be the workers. The queen is stuck here, she's staying here, they're not going anywhere without her. Then after you see eggs in here, after you see brood, after she's doing her thing, then you can lift that box up, remove the queen excluder, put it back down. They're secure. They're going to stick around. Good idea? I think it's a good idea. And the other thing is sometimes those unmated new virgin queens are so skinny and skittish and little that they can actually zip right through the queen excluder. But that's the best you can do. Make it as hospitable for them as possible. Don't get into them all the time. Don't harass them. And when you do go in to look at them on a nice warm day, spritz them with sugar syrup instead of the smoker. Do everything you can not to stress them out. Now, yeah, that's pretty much it. Next question is from Walter Morgan, Titusville, Pennsylvania. I'm interested in catching a feral swarm. Everybody is in the spring. Can't wait. Hopefully as close to the natural European black bee as possible here, and using a Layens Hive. And I'm using Layens Hive this year too, and that's what I'm going to have to put in that thing, is a swarm. Think this is too ambitious for a newbie? Nope, catching a swarm is pretty awesome. I would love to go to the Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association breakfast and have real life meetings soon. By the way, the Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association is the association that I belong to. So it'd be awesome for those of you who can look it up and join it. They have a website, they have a Facebook page and everything else. I don't often make it to the monthly Saturday meetings because I'm a photographer and I'm busy on Saturdays and weekends. But we have these midweek breakfasts where everybody gets together. And that's where I like to go, if invited, of course. And talk about new stuff that's coming out for beekeepers and beekeeping equipment and things like that. So it'd be great if you joined for that. So anyway, and that's, western, northeast Ohio, western Pennsylvania, western New York. We have members from all those states there. So, but here's the thing about new beekeepers wanting to get started. It's a great idea to try to catch a swarm, but guess what is a sure thing? Swarms are not a sure thing. A sure thing would be buying a package of bees or buying a nucleus of bees. The nucleus is a colony of bees in a small box. Usually it's 3 to 5 frames. Queen, mated, the entire thing. It's, the entire eusocial insect has its representation there. Workers, foragers, the queen's laying, you have nurse bees to feed them, you have pollen stored, you have some nectar in there. That's your quickest buildup, and that's your sure thing in spring. Most nucleus colonies cannot be shipped. They're just too heavy, too fragile, so you have to go pick them up in person, which is actually a very good thing. Because when you pick up a nucleus of bees, they're established and you're going to transport it yourself. So you're going to control the temperature extremes that they're exposed to. You're going to take care of them en route, and you're going to bring them in. You're going to install them in your final hive configuration right away. Let's compare that to a package of bees. Package of bees, non-related worker bees in a package with a queen in a cage that is mated. She's ready to lay. So the queen is good, but we don't know what temperature extremes that queen bee goes through on her way to your house. So the good news is they can be shipped anywhere. The bad news is you don't know what's happened to them on their travels. So the queen can actually have damaged fertility in transit. I'm not saying she will. I'm saying those potentials exist. So these are the differences in what to expect when you get a package of bees and you get a nucleus colony that you pick up yourself from somebody who developed those bees by making splits and things like that, establishing nukes, banking queens, and all the details that go into that. So the packages come, and that's a great way to start off. It's a sure thing. This year, Man Lake, the Olivarez family that does the Saskatraz bees, all these big breeders are going to be late. They've already put the alert out to tell everybody that they're not going to get their packages. I think they're a week behind, and that's because they're a week behind in mating their queens and putting their packages together. So I think all across the country, all these big companies, some smaller backyard beekeepers make extra money by putting together nucleus colonies. So they also, these are the things that you want to know when you're looking at where to source your bees. And I'm explaining this even though the question is whether or not catching a swarm is too ambitious. Swarm catching and hiving is actually very easy. The problem is everybody wants swarms in spring. Everybody wants the biggest swarms in spring. Remember that catch a swarm in May, it's worth a load of hay, so everybody wants them. And you don't want to wait, way late in the year because you want your colony to build up its resources to get through winter. That's what they're all doing. So some companies, like right now, they're wrapping up, if they're not already finished, with the almond pollination in California. And we're talking millions of colonies of bees. Some commercial beekeepers actually sell off their bees right after these big pollination contracts are fulfilled. And that's how they also make more money off it. So they'll sell bees to people that are putting together packages, installing queens, and shipping those out. So some sideliners actually buy in mated queens, get cheap packages from commercial operations, put them together, and ship them out at triple the income. So it's a way for them to make money. So again, when a package comes, the bees that are with the queen are not of the same genetics or the same line. Sometimes they're end-of-the-road kind of foragers that are piled together in a thing. So they're not as good as the nucleus colony. I'm not saying all packages are like that, or I'm not saying also that all nukes have been well handled. So knowing your source, knowing their credibility, knowing how they've treated the bees, what line of bees they are, and how consistent their genetics are, and things like that. There are also sometimes lines of bees that have a specific list of authorized breeders and sellers of the line. So when you go to companies like breeders like the Olivarez family, I believe they're the only authorized breeders of the Saskatraz line of bees in the United States. So if you have someone else that you've never heard of before selling Saskatraz queens and packages, look into the background of that beekeeper and find out if they're actually an authorized seller of those genetics. That way you'll make sure that you're not wasting your money, and we want to support the people that are doing it right, that are doing it legally. So there you go. The other thing is interstate bees. They should come with certificates of health and all that stuff. So when you get stuff through Man Lake, they're not putting the packages together. They're just a brokerage for the main breeders that are shipping them. And when you get it, it'll show, the paperwork will show the original breeder, what kind of treatments they've had, the genetic line, and that they are disease-free. All important stuff to have. So now back to this question, let's say we get the swarm. Because he goes on to say here, I would love to keep bees in a natural way, much like you do, although I would hope to have local queens. Do you think that means that I will be in for lots of disappointments, for local mite-resistant queens? The other thing is, he said he didn't want to rob anyone near him of their bees by collecting their swarms. So I have thoughts on that too. Now I've mentioned this neighbor before. He's been keeping bees for decades, and he's never bought a bee. And that's because he collects swarms. So what if my bees swarm and I don't catch it? I don't see it, I'm not home. Let's say that happens. Take off on their own. Am I going to be upset at my neighbor a mile away, 2 miles away, for collecting and hiving a swarm that emitted from my apiary? Not at all, I don't care. I want them to have those genetics, especially if they're good. So I don't think a lot of beekeepers are upset if you happen to live near them and you can benefit by setting out a swarm trap and collecting a swarm that you know darn well probably came from that beekeeper. Especially if you're familiar with their genetics and you find out that those traits exist in the swarm that you collected and that it's probably their bees. I see nothing wrong with that, because unless you hive them, the chances of them making it on their own are very slight. So I have no problems at all. Somebody else in another question on another Q&A Friday said that they were like right next to someone, a big breeder of Russian bees. And they set out traps all over the place to collect as many of those swarms as they could. Why not? Those bees are potentially lost. They're in jeopardy, they're exposed, they're looking for a cavity to occupy anyway. Their chances are much better when you collect and hive those bees. And then, of course, keep all the records you can about their behaviors and everything. So I see nothing wrong with any of that. And guess what? That was my last question of the day. So this is kind of a light Friday. So now this is the fluff period. We're just going to talk, shoot the breeze. This is the filler stuff. And yes, we hope to see Doug here at a Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeeper Association meeting. Oh, I want to congratulate the person that won the 100th episode competition, and that was Andrew Lopez and his family. And now I'm going to post the pictures of Andrew, the winner, with all the things that he won. So you can look at this picture with all the goodies. And then the other thing is with his oldest daughter, who wanted to see if she would show up on today's video. So there you have it. There she is. And those are the winners of the 100th episode competition. So, and thank you for participating. Thank you for all those who participated in that. That was a lot of fun, and it was fun to ship things out to them. Number 2, join us for the hive gate testing. For those of you who haven't seen it, I did a video just about this. I know it looks like nothing. This is a hive entrance called the Hive Gate, H-Y-F-E-G-A-T-E. You can Google it, you can look it up, look up the company. BIQ is the name of the company. What I did is I set up a web page just for this study on my website, thewaytobee.org, and I'll put a link to that down below. So if you want to give feedback on how this works to slow down robbing, it's really designed to protect your colonies from wasp attacks. So the yellow jackets and all the stuff that are really pesky. A lot of you have already joined up, sent your information in, and we're creating the database for that. And it's going to be really fantastic to see how they work. So what's going to be happening also in spring, there's going to be some robbing going on. So I want to know how these work for robbing. So if you want to read more about the Hive Gate experiment, and if you want to join our citizen science project, this is what it's going to be. Anyway, you can read about it there. We're going to be putting more information there, and you can read about the inventor of it. But I want feedback on that, so if you want to join for that, that's fantastic. Next, oh yeah, this was really funny today. One of the new hive designs that I'm putting out in my apiary this year is the Layens Hive Super Insulated. I bought the best one I could get from horizontalhive.com, which is Dr. Leo Sherishkin's website. And what came in the mail today, because now Dr. Leo says not to feed your bees, not to do anything to intervene, inspect them twice a year and all that stuff. I'm departing from that. I mean, I'm trying the Layens Hive out. It's going to be in my apiary. I'm going to put a swarm in it. So we're talking about swarms today. We're going to put a swarm, see how that thing goes, but it has a lot of unique stuff. So one of the things that Dr. Leo sells are these frame feeders, which, by the way, I don't use in any of my hives because I use hive top feeders. But what I thought was really funny was 2 of these came just like an hour ago, and they had all this paper stuffed in here. And I thought, well, that's interesting wrapping paper. This almost looks like a book, and it actually is. And guess what it says right here? Support in the Wreckage is the chapter right here. And the name of this book is Living in the Reality of Loss. It's okay that you're not okay. So they're recycling this book and packaging, but I thought, this is talking right to the people that lost all their bees. So when your bees died and everything else, support in the wreckage, the phoenix rising from the flames, and staying with the program. Don't give up on your bees. So this is kind of all these, so they're recycling a book, but I thought it was really funny because it ties in with a lot of beekeepers that are throwing in the towel. A lot of beekeepers came into the spring. None of their bees made it. They lost faith in their ability to keep bees, and they're trying to sell their stuff. Don't do that after 1 year, 1 season, because I want you to know that's a sick feeling, by the way. I mean, years ago, 2008, I was coming home. I was teaching art and design for business as a substitute teacher. Yeah, nothing but respect for those substitute teachers. Anyway, so I came home, big snowstorm, go to look at my apiary. Every single hive was laying on its side in the snow, completely apart. All the bees were dead. I went out there, of course, put them all together, stacked them all back up and everything else. But I was new to beekeeping. That was my 2nd or 3rd year of beekeeping. And I lost 100% of my bees that year because I underestimated how strong the wind was going to be, that the hives could be blown off their stands and all this other stuff. I didn't strap them with shipping straps like I do now. And it was a total loss. Now it would be easy to say, well, I'm just going to quit that nonsense. But my interest in bees, far stronger than my pride when it comes to, because that's the other thing. You have to admit to your friends and other people, hey, how are the bees doing? Oh, they're all dead because I suck as a beekeeper. But yeah, because it was totally under my control. I didn't strap down the hives. I did not do everything I could to keep them from toppling over. So that's how I've been through several iterations of different hive stands as a result of that. That's why the hive stands I have right now are super strong. Nothing blows them over. They don't go anywhere, so I don't lose it. But so for those who are just starting out and you just got your hives out there, you put all this money into it, your wife told you couldn't do it, or your husband told you couldn't do it, and they didn't want those bees in the first place. Look at all the money you've wasted. I mean, it just compounds. You're just like Eeyore coming back home, into the kitchen, not wanting to admit anything. The other route that some people do is they lost all their bees and they don't want to admit it, so they're buying a bunch of new bees right away. So you see, they're still out there. Look, they're still flying. So abandon pride, if that's even possible, and try to your best ability, figure out what the failure was. Often it's completely out of your control. And you're going to find out that mites are very high on the list of winter die-outs. Also, we get this false sense of security. January, February, get a warm day. That's why some people go, hey, Fred, how many of your hives made it? Well, I'm not even saying how many made it yet because they could die tomorrow. So the numbers, that's the other thing I don't like is, we all provide statistical information about how the hives are kept, whether they're treated or not. Supplemental feeding, whether you insulated, whether you had a top vent, whether you had a bottom entrance only. All these things contribute to statistical data as to which hive designs, which types of bees, what kind of treatments, all these things come together. And help everyone through the years as we figure out statistically what your chances are going to be getting them through. And that data gets collected too early, because hive-head colonies that you think they're dead, you get this warm day and you find out they were just stayed clustered longer than the others, and out they come and they're flying and they're not being robbed. That's the other thing. You can get excited and see a colony that you thought was dead, but you see lots of traffic on the landing board and you think, they did make it, they are alive. Do you see pollen going in? So you see pollen going in on the landing board of that one over there. So that's queen right. But you come back over here, this one's got all this activity, but I don't see any pollen. Good chance they're just being robbed out. So you don't really know until the real warm weather gets here. Those of you who are in the south already know your losses. But so my words of encouragement are, much like this very interesting packaging material that came from Dr. Leo. Living in the reality of loss. So appropriate for beekeepers. Loss is a reality for every beekeeper every year. I only know of 1 or 2 people that are very successful and get almost all of their hives through every winter. That's a tiny miracle, but then you have to stay suspicious. Why are my bees making it, and are they really making it? What else is going on? Are they queenless? So there's a lot of stuff, but that was really funny, so I just thought I would share that story with you. The other thing is, what am I doing this spring? Fred, what are you doing this spring to help your bees and everything else? Well, I was going to be putting on these pollen patties because they got a bunch of them, but the pollen's already coming in the hives, and I realized the first couple of hives that I went to put those in, there's not enough room for the pollen patty. You really have to smash it to get it in there, and I just decided not to do it. They're bringing in pollen already. So if you live near me and you want to buy some pollen patties cheap, it's like snake oil at this point, because the bees are already bringing in resources from the environment. And so what else am I doing? I'm going to be, don't forget, this is part of a long-term study evaluation. So this is called Hive Alive. And I've talked about feeding stimulants, Honeybee Healthy, Pro Health, Beekeeper's Choice, all these essential oils and things like that. Those have not been supported scientifically with data to justify that they boost brood as promised, that they boost the health, overall health and well-being of the bees as promised. There's nothing supporting that so far. Even as an appetite stimulant, essential oil mixes, those commercially available ones that I mentioned in particular, the bees do not choose those over regular sugar syrup without them. So the only thing that's different is this stuff that comes from Ireland, Hive Alive. It's a long-term study, and I'm going to give you the scientific reference for it. So if I'm doing anything to my hives, it's with Hive Alive. I'm going to put this into my tiny colonies that potentially have nosema issues. That was the other thing. I was all excited to smash bee guts and collect the dead ones and look at them under the microscope and see those evidence of nosema, but instead all the bees had was routine diarrhea, so that didn't help. But Hive Alive I'm going to be using for any colonies that require sugar syrup, which are going to be going into spring. And it's going to be 2.5 milliliters of Hive Alive per liter. It has a definite impact on Nosema ceranae, or ceranae, however you want to say it, spore loads. It proves that it reduces those. And my study was going to be smash the bee guts, look at them under the microscope, treat the colony with Hive Alive, see those spores go away in subsequent counts. But if you don't have them to begin with, you can't count them when they go away. But there are secondary benefits to using it. It's made from Irish seaweed extract. And I'm going to give you have your pencil ready? Ready to write this down? Look up the Journal of Apiculture Research, volume 54 of 2015, issue 5. It shows the details of the experiment, and the results were really substantial. So not only did it help with nosema if you have it. There's two types of nosema that are predominant in backyard beekeeping. Nosema apis, which most people never see anymore, and then Nosema ceranae, or serrani, whatever you want to say. That's what we most likely encounter now. So, but what if you didn't want to smash bee guts and look at that under your microscope? What if you just wanted to give them a treatment that would deal with that if it exists, but also boost your bee brood in spring? Hive Alive. The only thing that I can recommend, actually, right now, spirulina is being looked at. Different results, bee weight, bee health, mid-gut health, and everything else. So it's dry powdered spirulina. But I'm looking for more data on that, even though the initial data looks really good. So those are the two things if you're going to feed sugar syrup to your bees to get going. Hive Alive. And that's it for today. So thanks for watching. I hope you benefited from today's video. If you have any questions at all, please write them down in the comment section. If you don't have a YouTube channel and you still want to submit a question, please go to thewaytobee.org and fill out a form there. And then I'll get your question and potentially talk about it on one of these Friday episodes. So this weekend, the bees are going to be flying, and it's time to put out what I've been putting out right now, which is the Ultra Bee Dry Pollen Substitute, open as forage. Some people ask, can we put that inside the hive? No, I would not put any dry pollen subs inside your beehive. What I want to do is put it out, have it available for foragers. How far away from your apiary are you going to put this? 50 yards to the west of my apiary. So that's it. Have it available. Don't let it get wet. Don't let it get rained on. It works too. Ultra Bee, Hive Alive, Hive Kate, lots of stuff going on. Have a fantastic weekend. Thanks so much for watching.